on the impact of World War I. So let's put some context here. After the war, we were in the midst of this Red Scare, and a Red Scare is a nationwide anti-radical, anti-immigrant hysteria provoked by the mounting fear that a communist revolution like the one that took place in Russia during World War I would happen in America. There's also leftover feelings from World War I, concern about Germany and worrying about spies and being everywhere, and from the Espionage and Sedition Acts. In addition to that, we saw the Great Migration, which we've already covered. These large movement of especially African American population from the rural South to northern cities. And to give you some perspective on that, this graph shows the population in the African American population in cities like New York and Chicago and St. Louis and Cleveland in 1910 and 1930. You can see by the different colored graph, by the lighter toned, the top half of the graph, how much it grew from the Great Migration. In addition to this time period of the first 20 years of the 1900s, remember we had this huge number of influx of immigrants moving into the country. We had this urbanization, which we covered in the unit a couple of units ago, and the growth of cities. We had widespread tenements and all the problems that went with that. And in the midst of this, there was a Hollywood movie made in 1915 which glorified the Ku Klux Klan, this white supremacist group that had risen after the Civil War. And in this movie, many of the Klan symbols which we are familiar with today, the white costumes and the burning of crosses, actually came from the film. This isn't something that the Klan had done after the Civil War. And this is kind of this issue of life imitating art and art imitating life, where there were elements of this white supremacist kind of simmering in pockets of the nation, and the film tapped into that. It's a fictional piece, tapped into it by telling the story of what happened allegedly after the Civil War, though it was clearly fiction and clearly not very historically accurate. Because of the movie, the Ku Klux Klan, this white supremacist group, restarted, which it had died after the Civil War Reconstruction, started again in 1915 by a man named William Joseph Simmons outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and he started with 15 members. The growth based on anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, which means anti-Jewish, prohibitionist, so want to prohibit alcohol, in addition to a racist agenda. And this is a photograph of them marching in the streets of Washington, D.C. You see the Capitol in the background. So it was much more than the just anti-African American racism of the time right after the Civil War. They really expanded this to include this nativist idea of anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic, and including prohibitionism, which was associated with immigrants, the consumption of alcohol, that is. The Klan was most effective in the South and Midwest, especially Indiana and Michigan as far as the Midwest is concerned, and in the West in Colorado and Oregon. The Klan was most active in fast-growing cities like Detroit and Memphis and Dayton and Atlanta and Dallas and Houston. And the pictures I'm showing you here, taken many of them from that time period, I want to remind you that the imagery the new Klan had used actually came from a Hollywood movie. That wasn't historically what the Klan had done, and they got the idea from a movie. Well, in this time of racial discontent, there was a race riot in Chicago. On July 27th of 1919, a white man threw rocks at African Americans swimming in Lake Michigan. Now remember, we talked about segregation in the Urban America unit, there was not just segregation in the South, but also in some cities like Chicago. There were beaches set aside for African Americans, and then everyone else would have another set of beaches. And apparently, a couple of the kids, and these were just teenagers, had gotten too close to the white beach, and so this guy started throwing rocks at him. An African American was hit with a rock. A teenage boy was hit with a rock, and he drowned. Police made no arrests. Everyone saw who threw it, everyone saw what happened, but the police made no arrests. And this sparked some widespread rioting in the city of Chicago. In those race riots, 38 died and over 500 were injured, and there were lootings and fires and arson. Now, this should sound somewhat familiar, not the throwing at rocks and having someone drown, but the unnecessary death of somebody and nothing legally happening because of it, and then the protests which follow. This should sound familiar to something that's happened in relatively recent time. And the Chicago race riots, and I do want to go back to where it talked about 38 died, I believe all of the people who were killed were African American, and most of the ones who were injured. This sparked riots in 25 cities across the North. So this led to widespread rioting, kind of what we saw like in the summer of 2020. One of the worst of those rioting was in a town called Elaine, Arkansas, where between 100 to 200 African Americans and about 10 white people were killed because of the race rioting that took place. 115 African Americans were charged with crimes and 12 convicted of murder and sentenced to death. No white people were charged with any crime. And the picture you're looking at here is from a newspaper from that time period where the headlines read, "The Negroes plan to kill all whites," and the slaughter was to begin with 21 prominent men as first victims. But if you look at the facts of the case, where between 100 to 200 African Americans were killed and 10 white people, but 115 African Americans were charged and 12 convicted of murder, and no white people were charged with any crime. And then in 1921, there was a major race riot in Tulsa. This was sparked by an African American shoe shiner, though he shined shoes for a living, accidentally stepped on a white woman's foot as they were both entering the building. And let me give you a little more background information. So this young man, this teenager who worked as a shoe shiner, there was no public bathroom because of segregation that he could use in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in this downtown area. The only bathroom he could use was like on the top floor of some department store. And he was entering into the elevator to take upstairs to use the one toilet, and he did step on the foot of a white girl who, when that happened, she screamed, and the man was picked up and charged by the Tulsa police with attempted rape for stepping on her foot accidentally while trying to go to the bathroom. Hundreds of whites, led by Klan members, go to the courthouse and demand that the man be turned over to them for lynching. They were going to kill him. Not without any trial, they just wanted to have him killed. And what followed was 12 hours of rioting and looting by whites. You see this person pictured here participating in that. Whites would drive through African American neighborhoods and shoot at anyone they see. 1,000 homes and businesses were destroyed by fire in this Tulsa race riot, with over 100 people were killed. And I do want to spend a moment talking about this. When President Trump had his rally in Tulsa, this was the event that drew so much anger at the time of his rally, because they were going back to this race right from 100 years ago or 99 years ago. So I once again reference this Red Scare that was taking place. In addition to the racial issues, what started from this Red Scare was this Palmer raids, a series of raids by the U.S. Department of Justice to capture, arrest, and deport radicals, led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. Now, it's important that you understand where these came from. Remember of the Alien and Sedition Acts and the hysteria caused in World War I. Well, this is just right after that. And remember that Russia had a communist revolution during the war. And so all of these pent-up feelings had kind of come spilling out. And we have all of these immigrants living now, moving to the United States in the first 20 years of the 1900s. And we have this massive migration of African Americans from the South to the North. And people don't handle change very well. And American cities were changing. And we looked for someone to blame. In the Palmer raids, as they were called, more than 3,000 people were arrested and held for various lengths of time. Most were held without any warrants, any arrest warrants at all. The Department of Justice officials claimed to have taken several bombs from, quote, radicals. What they displayed to the press when they had this press conference were actually iron balls. So these were like cannonballs that weren't really even made into cannonballs, but they were like painted black to look like bombs, and they weren't bombs at all. But they basically lied to the press and to the American people what they had taken. And what all these raids and all these arrests netted was actually 4 pistols total, taken from people who are said to be radical. And more than 500 people, pictured here, were deported from the United States for their participation or, quote, being radical. And I got a couple of newspaper headlines from the time period. Endicott is a place in New York. Reds would be a communist. They were having a meeting, and the police broke in and they captured and deported a bunch of people. Another newspaper from Lowell, Massachusetts, where they combed the city for alleged radicals, and they said they had, quote, perfect cases against 2,613 persons in these nationwide radical raids. But I want you to remember, no matter what the newspaper said, in reality, they had come up with 4 pistols and some fake bombs. Now, here, this is from New York, where they said that Russia was directing a campaign to be carried out in the United States. And Palmer declares there will be a no let-up in coming year of these raids against radicals. If you remember when we did our unit on imperialism and this idea of yellow journalism, where Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst ran articles in the newspaper to get people fired up about what Spain was doing, and started the Spanish-American War. What their number one goal really was to sell newspapers to make money. And remember, we talked about in that unit about the USS Maine blowing up, and we're really not sure who did it or how that all happened. And we even did the assignment on what was in the New York Journal about that. What printed things that were really, if not out and out lies, they were certainly lacked in accuracy in many areas. But remember, their goal was to make money. And these stories make me think of some of these newspaper articles that were printed now in 1920 and 1921 about these radicals, alleged radicals in the United States. It's a similar type of thing. However, as soon as I say that, it's important for you to remember something else. On September 16, 1920, and this is Wall Street, where the New York Stock Exchange is and many financial institutions are, on this date in 1920, some terrorists, some radical terrorists, did load up a bunch of iron bars and in a wagon with all kinds of explosives in a wagon and parked it in front of this building and detonated it and killed many people. Now, when we studied about earlier in World War I in the Committee on Public Information, remember we learned about George Creel, the head of that, where he said that fear is an important element to be bred in the civilian population. You want to make people afraid. So I know it's a little complicated, but real stuff did happen, like this explosion, and there were some terrorists acting out, and it caused people to be afraid. And then we have newspaper articles stoking those fears, making people more afraid. And there were some bad things happening, but in reality, not as many as people may have thought. But because of all the changes taking place in society, where we have race riots and we've got all kinds of other issues taking place, fear was a real thing. And in that, the Palmer raids made people feel better about what was taking place, especially when things like this taking place in Wall Street. And on top of that, another layer on top of that is this idea of demobilization. This is the transition from wartime to peacetime production levels. Millions of soldiers returned home, which would cause unemployment to rise and wages to fall. These millions of soldiers want jobs. They're no longer going to be in the army. The war is over. So we have lots of extra workers now. Women who had been encouraged to join the workforce were now encouraged to go back home, not work. There was a farm crisis, and we learned earlier this unit how farmers were encouraged to greatly expand production, to borrow money and expand production. The problem is they did, but then by 1920, the government, by 1919 even, government doesn't need to buy all this surplus food because they don't have the soldiers to feed. Well, when the demand for the food drops, the cost, the price of that drops, and this really hurt farmers who had borrowed money to expand production based on future earnings which now don't exist. The government canceled $2 billion in government contracts. This picture is from 1916, but these are all bombs that they were being made. Government doesn't need all those bombs if we're no longer at war. Factories cut production, they cut wages and fired workers. Well, this led to strikes. Workers protest, and the only weapon they have are strikes. So their wages are being cut and they're being laid off, so they go on strike. In Seattle, there's a general strike, which means workers from like every industry went on strike, and 60,000 workers left their jobs in Seattle. Newspapers blamed the immigrants for the strike. And the strike ended without workers winning any of their demands. And in Boston, the police commissioner fired 19 officers for engaging in union activities. We learned in an earlier unit how difficult it was to form unions. So we have 19 police officers trying to start a union, and they get fired for that. So in response, 75% of the Boston police force went on strike. Now you can predict what's going to happen if 75% of the police refuse to go to work. How is the city going to respond? They respond by violence and looting. So now that there's no police, they just do whatever they want and they steal. I'm talking about the people of Boston. So the state militia is called in by then Governor Calvin Coolidge, who's pictured on the right here, and he, of course, would become eventually president of the United States. And the newspapers blame foreigners and communists for the strike. And we have the steel strike, protesting low wages and long hours and dangerous working conditions 365,000 steelworkers went on strike. The company owners blamed the strike on immigrant workers, and again, the state militias called in. In addition to that, the company brought in African Americans from the South and immigrants from Mexico to break the strike, so they were going to work to fill in for the workers who went on strike. It's ironic, if you think about it, it's interesting to me, that the company blamed the strike on immigrant workers, but they solved from their perspective the strike by bringing in immigrant workers. Strikers are beaten, shot, and jailed by the police. The United Mine Workers went on strike, and 400,000 coal miners went on strike. They wanted higher pay and shorter hours because their wages were frozen at 1917 levels because of the war. To help out the war, they agreed not to take any pay raise. But war is over, prices are going way up, and their wages are not going up. The mine owners claimed the strike was being financed by communist Russia. Interestingly enough, it was. It was encouraged by communist Russia to have them go on strike. Unfortunately, the pay issue was real. But there was an element of truth to the Red Scare that was going on. So this post-war period was complicated. There were some things that were going on that were concerning. There was some terrorist activities. There were some elements of communist Russia in the United States trying to stir up some trouble. But workers had legitimate demands. The Great Migration, which African Americans were encouraged to move north during the war, now that they were there, white people's fears and racism led to race riots. The government cracked down on radicals because there were some radicals there, but then they overreacted and arrested and deported hundreds of people. All of these things are elements of the post-war world.